Hi everyone, this is Joe from the Inward Markings Garment Company. This is episode 3 of the daily vlog that I'm doing since launching the brand on Sunday. Thanks for anyone who's watched the video, visited the website, or visited at Inward Markings, which is the Instagram account. Inwardmarkings.com is the website, and the online store is now working. There's 10 designs in the first release, and I will discuss those in future episodes. So if there's anything confusing or even offensive, there might be some clarity or more clarity, somewhat clarity, after viewing those episodes. Chapter 1 and 2 are up, and it will be necessary, I think, at this stage to view those if you want to get the most out of what I have to say today. Again, I'm not talking about stuff that's happened in my life thus far just for the sake of it, or for any other reason apart from the connections that I've made between things that have happened in my life previously to the last 22 or so months prior to the launch of this brand, which is something that I never expected to do prior to that time frame. And the process has been also unexpected and of enough interest for me to share it with the internet, which is not something that I typically do in video form. So it's reached a point where I feel like it's an important thing to share in this way. So yes, inwardmarkings.com and at inwardmarkings for the Instagram account. I just want to say first, before I start, yesterday was the start, if you like, of my discussion around drug use and the significance that it's had in my life, and I touched on broader issues as well that I think are certainly relevant to what I see going on in the world today. And if discussions regarding drug use are upsetting for you, please don't continue watching. If I was you, that's right. If I was you, I'd just log out or click away now. I also mentioned sexual abuse and rape yesterday. So again, if that's something that is upsetting and is not something you want to hear about, then also close this video. I don't think I'll be discussing so much sexual abuse matters today, but it might come up because it's all been part of this journey or process leading up till now. So it hasn't been a solely drug-based experience, but they're all interconnected. Like if you read Dr. Julie Holland's great book Moody Bitches, you will get an insight into the way, like, that our endogenous, like the drugs that are most often talked about in terms of, you know, the drug war or people addicted to drugs, they have a basis within us. It's not like these drugs enter our body and suddenly, you know, we enter some kind of different realm. The neurotransmitters for those substances are within us already, and we produce chemicals or analogous chemicals within ourselves. It's part of our physiology. It's in my mind the desire, the drive for altering our experiences via drugs is innate, and it manifests itself in different ways. So it is not just through the use of drugs. It could be through activities that then generate a greater production of those chemicals that are endogenous to us. So I'm not here to just rant at you about my views on drugs, but so I might be vague on certain things, or be mistaken, or get something wrong. So do your own research, please, which is what I've done, both I guess experientially and via reading and watching, etc. Because that is what's going to be most meaningful to people anyway, as I'm sure you already know. So where I left off yesterday was the near-death experience that I had on the west coast of Australia, in a body of water called Shark Bay. So subsequent to that experience, we did end up travelling up to Darwin along the coast, and then coming back down, not around the east coast, but more through kind of the bottom south-western tip of Queensland down to Sydney, and then rural New South Wales. And of particular interest at that time was a couple of friends who were living in Sydney, inner city Sydney, and there was a really active warehouse squatting, like illegal rave scene, whereby people weren't seeking to harm others and breaking the law to do so, but the illegality was about taking over unused, empty spaces in urban areas, and putting on raves, I guess, or parties with electronic music. But what was distinct about this scene was that it stood apart from, and it probably was a direct kind of, it was deliberately in direct contrast to the commercial rave scene. So that's why I'm kind of hesitating with using the term rave. And these parties had a more, I guess you could call it more punk electronic music, and certainly the people who attended the parties and the people who created them were not representative of the commercial rave scene, and images that might come to mind are more like materialistic and about selling tickets purely for money. It was actually about community, about sharing ideas. There was concepts like the safe autonomous zone, just safe spaces where people, where diversity was embraced, and where people, there was a freedom to explore ideas as well as behaviours, and yes, that involved drug use, that were and still are really considered forbidden or taboo or deviant, or even sinful, depending on kind of the context. And so I was mainly staying in rural New South Wales, and then would kind of relish opportunities to go into the city. And a friend that I was hanging out with in the lead up to a party that was being put on, this was at a legitimate venue. Like when I say illegal party scene, it wasn't like parties wouldn't be put on if it wasn't an illegal space. There was a really strong, similar kind of party scene that was described to me, that was based in Goa in India. Now, I didn't experience it directly, so I don't know what went down there, but of particular interest was the production of LSD that was occurring in Goa at that time. It was on a global scale very prominent, and it was kind of like an epicenter. I don't think that's the case anymore. And so LSD that was produced there had found its way into Sydney, and what was being heavily discussed was so LSD is produced often in tabs, cardboard tabs. So there's a large sheet, and then it's perforated to create small tabs. And what had arrived from Goa was, because there's often art, like designs that form that sheet, and you will hear of like things like Mercedes-Benz logos and so forth, which compared to what happened then, are kind of lame, because this was a dot computer graphic printed Ganesha image. I'm not an expert on religion, but Ganesha is a Hindu deity, I'm pretty sure. Forgive me if I've got that wrong. So one entire sheet would be the image of Ganesha, and then each of the tabs would be small portions of that image. So unless you were, bought the whole lot, or you were the person distributing it or selling it, you wouldn't be able to see the entire image. But it was something that you could imagine, and anyone who's seen images of Ganesha will know that it's a really potent image, and a really cool one, depending on what you're into. And so a formative experience that occurred when taking this LSD was this great feeling of power, of just not a power in the sense of ruling over anything, or feeling any kind of malevolence toward other people, but just this incredible uplifting feeling. And what was significant though about that experience for me was that I feel like that I learned a lesson from it in terms of the interaction of the LSD on that occasion with what I believe is my ego. And there was an aspect of that experience where my ego went into an elevated state that, in hindsight, I found, to be unsettling and kind of ridiculous. So with that upsurge of euphoria, a euphoric upsurge, there was also, for me, I don't know about anyone else at the event, a kind of like this competitiveness that arose within me. And it wasn't a malevolent one, but it was one where, for instance, I felt like I wanted to like be on the dance floor on my own and be just trying to dance for the longest time, to dance for longer than the other people there. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but it was, for me, after considering it, it was, I think, an experience that I needed to learn from, in terms of kind of what the ego is capable of and how ridiculous it can be, and how kind of non-useful, if you like, it can be. Like, where can there be any benefit in that kind of competitiveness? And because of the effects of the LSD, it was a hyper competitiveness, and that's something that I certainly see in mainstream sporting cultures today. And I do really question how valuable that is in terms of where the world's at the present time. I'm not saying, you don't see me picketing outside of sporting stadiums, but I just think it's something worth questioning. So there wasn't any fallout from that experience. I went about my life there were the challenges that people often experience in like late adolescence, but for me it was not due to the drug use, but it was all kind of mixed up in the experience with drugs that I hadn't previously, that I was still like wasn't able to comprehend at the time. My past experiences. So there was all these different things. There was this confluence of different factors that led to a very intensive period, and there was other drug use at that time as well, and it just became so overwhelming that I needed to leave Sydney, and I returned to Perth. And so my plan upon returning to Perth, like I did have an idea upon leaving high school to do the straight into university thing and take that mainstream career trajectory, but that was pretty much kind of banished, or not the concept of going to university, but just that timeline after the experiences like the one I just described occurred. What was particularly so upon returning to Perth, I felt, as strange as this sounds, and this is connected to what I talked about in the last episode in terms of always having a drive and resonance with drug culture. I was just adamant on just further experimentation, further use, and yes, that included injecting drug use as well. And look, if that's something that just disgusts you beyond recovery, then I'm glad that you'll no longer continue this series and not support the brand, because maybe do some reading, and hopefully maybe this video series will assist you. Before you pass judgment, don't just simply rely on a headline that you glimpsed when walking past your lunch table at work, or some shitty sensationalist news report that you happened to look up at while you were on your smartphone, instead of actually paying attention to the TV, and do whatever you want. But if you're going to pass judgment on something, at least fucking, read up on it. Like, there are people, for example, who before they, engage in a political process, want to read up on the political system and educate themselves completely about it. And I've only respect for people like that. Like, there's just there's a lot of faux intellectualism, a lot of false claims to expertise, and like it's kind of is it an epidemic? I haven't done the research, but it can seem like that. Now, while staying at my family home after returning to Perth, and this was in the period just after I'd returned from Sydney and hadn't found further work, or hadn't really made the next step. It was just this transition period. I had an experience that I am calling into question a lot more now. I mean, it's kind of been something that I've thought here and there about since, but because I was still so young at the time and drug use was involved, I kind of wrote it off and didn't really consider it too much, similar to the near-death experience in Carnarvon. But what's also been influential is the sharing of information that's happened on an unprecedented level via the internet, in terms of spiritual experiences and inexplicable phenomena, etc., where lots of reports are actually being shared, and it makes me think, God, no wonder people kind of derailed in a destructive way prior to that technology, because they would have felt so much more isolated, and they would have just been left up left within their own minds and kind of the opinions of others, and it would have been maddening. So with that ability to share this information, it's just, it means that people can, well, for me, I've been like, okay, so there's potentially some validity here, and this is something that, a whole heap of people have been experiencing. So in this case, it was about the dark figure that people have reported seeing while lying in bed. And for me, it was about being, what resonates with me is this idea of this state between complete wakefulness and sleep, kind of like this middle ground, like possibly like a semi-dream state. And I distinctly remember a dark figure emerging at the end of my bed, but not feeling at all scared by this presence. No identifying features. And look, if your freaky stuff is not something you like to be subjected to, I'd definitely log out now. And I felt unable to move when I saw this this figure at the end of my bed that had no kind of gender or any kind of descriptive features that I can relay. But what the figure proceeded to do was to insert or push some form of energy, but basically what I felt was it came up through my asshole and filled my entire body up until the top of my head, and my back arched as I was lying in bed, and it lasted for around 10 seconds, possibly longer, and then I fell back down onto the bed. My back stopped arching, and I went back down onto the bed, and the figure disappeared. And what exactly happened next is hazy in my memory. Whether I fell back to sleep, well, I definitely did not get up, so I must have fell back to sleep. And in hindsight, I am wondering why I didn't talk to someone about it. I did write it off as just some crazy dream experience, but it's certainly unlike. It was not. It was too wakeful to just be a dream. But when you're 17, 18, you just. In my case, I didn't. I just was probably too dismissive of it. And so, again, based on how my life has progressed subsequently, I've called that into question, and it's part of this retelling. I then, after working rurally, returned to Perth, but inner city Perth this time, and I wasn't staying with family, and met with people who were connected to the Sydney warehouse scene, funnily enough, and also local Perth people some of whom I'm still friends with. And we all had a shared interest in putting on similar events in Perth, which there had not been up until that point, or if there had, we weren't aware of it. And for me, it was about so throughout this whole time that I've described so far, that kind of innate need to make a difference, to address kind of my perception of injustice, etc., was still active, and that's what fascinated me about that Sydney scene as well, was the politics that were intrinsically part of it. And so there is a mobile needle and syringe program in Perth, I think it's still operational, that addresses or prevents HIV and hepatitis C and hepatitis B transmission amongst people who inject drugs. And if you do the research rather than rely on shitty commercial media sources, you will see that these programs are not only successful, but they provide, in terms of disease prevention, but they provide invaluable support to people who are in great need of it. I've experienced that support as a person who's used those services, but there are certainly still people who use those services who are in much greater need than I was. But what I appreciated was being able to access the services, but also to just have conversations with people who had a non-judgmental perspective. That can make such a huge difference. Like, I think we place so much emphasis on, material support, and I understand why that is, and money being this, huge deal, but those connections and interactions that we have human to human, I just think are so valuable. And so we organised a couple of events, one in Fremantle and then one in Northbridge in inner city Perth. And the one in Northbridge was a house party, and again, LSD was a big part of that occasion. And I think the LSD on that occasion was from San Francisco, and I took it upon myself for a reason that I'm not too sure of. Did I just mention that the first warehouse party was, the first party in Fremantle was sought to raise funds for the mobile needle and syringe program? So that was why that's the main reason why I mentioned it. So it wasn't just about having parties, even though obviously that's a great thing to do, but there was a connection there in terms of social impact. Second party, not so much, but again, it was about community, bringing people together, and people of particular mindsets that question normative perceptions and values that I continue to consider restrictive, judgmental, unhelpful, even harmful. And so the second party was really wild, but the reason why I'm explaining is not to talk just about my partying life, is that the LSD experience that I had on that occasion was a further how would you put it? Just this idea of something greater, something beyond just our, everyday experience. So a noise complaint was made, so the police came, but I still had a batch of acid on me, and so I quickly ran into the house. The party was occurring in the backyard, and just squatted behind the bed in the front bedroom. The police had gone around the side, around the back, just to address the noise. They probably suspected drug use, but I don't think that was that was not what they would have been called for. And I was tripping at the time when I was taking refuge, and I was obviously in a heightened state with anxiety going on, but I was still feeling, really good. But was wondering, but had no idea what was going to happen, and so did not know when to emerge. And there was a presence in that room, and I distinctly remember looking up at a corner of where the ceiling and wall meets. There's like a force that was moving, and there was a point at which there was like a voice, not like a clear human voice, but kind of like a just this soft voice that said, it's okay now. Um, and at that point, I just went with the flow, went back out into the backyard, and the police had indeed left. Um, Later, that in the party, after the sun came up, it just got too hectic in the backyard, and I quickly walked off to a nearby park. And I think that's a really good thing to do, by the way, if you do engage with psychedelics, to go out into nature. And upon immersing myself in like the park and the removal of that, all the noise and the buzz, I looked over toward a tree trunk nearby, and there were like small elven-like creatures with glowing eyes who were just kind of like not saying anything, but kind of like giggling. They weren't something that I was scared of, but they seemed very friendly, and I was entranced by them. I didn't go over and touch them or anything like that. I was just entranced by looking at them. And at that exact moment, a friend who was part of that scene in terms of organising the parties walked into my view at that very exact moment. I still don't know. I should have asked, really, but I still don't know whether she was there because she knew I'd be there. But because of that, whatever you want to call it, synchronicity, co-occurrence of being entranced by those figures and her arriving, it just caused this amazing feeling within me. And I just felt this really strong connection to this person. And and we ended up having a very kind of brief relationship, intimate relationship. And it was a lot of fun. And it was a profound experience because of that confluence of events and how it made me feel, and then what it then led to in terms of my experiences with that woman. So that's where I'll leave it. And again, 32 minutes 55. Jesus Christ. Apologies if you've gotten this far. Chapter 4 will be next, obviously, and I will